crying, the darkness multiplying, and weary hearts denied. All I feel is my heartbeat, beating like a drum, beating with confusion. All I hear are the voices telling me to go, but I could never run, 'cause in my African dream, there's a new tomorrow. My African dream is a dream that we can follow. Now when the night begins to fall, I listen for your call, I listen for your heartbeat. Alone, my dream is just a dream, another false illusion, a shadow in the night. All I want is for our hearts to be beating just as one, to silence the confusion. Then the pain and the illusion will disappear again, and we will never run, 'cause in my African dream, there's a new tomorrow.
The Jewish community of Pretoria crowded into this space on the night of May the 15th, 1948. The occasion was a midnight service of thanksgiving. David Ben-Gurion had declared the establishment of the State of Israel the day before, after the British mandate over Palestine expired. Nearly every Jew in the city who could be here filled this building to capacity and occupied all the pews and galleries for the service. The synagogue had been consecrated 50 years beforehand, with the ever-involved Sammy Marks providing the bricks and light fittings for the cash-strapped Pretoria community. 10 years after the midnight service, it once more hosted a capacity congregation. But although there were some prominent South African Jews in attendance, it was no longer a synagogue, and the attendees weren't there for a service of thanksgiving. The shul was now a courtroom, and where the Aron Kodesh once stood sat 3 judges, presiding over what became known as one of the most famous trials in South African history, the treason trial. Among the defendants was Nelson Mandela. If ever there was a symbol of the Jewish community's involvement in the struggle for a democratic South Africa, this sadly abandoned, crumbling building is it. When the United Nations voted in favor of the partition of Palestine, the Jewish community in South Africa was immediately mobilized in support of the new State of Israel. Immediately following the vote, the South African Zionist Federation set up what was called the Palestine Emergency Fund. Within 2 months, more than £1 million had been raised, a considerable sum at the time, and even more remarkable when the small size of the South African community was taken into account. The community's appeal to Prime Minister Jan Smuts to allow the transfer of the money to Palestine was partly met. Because South Africa, as a dominion of Great Britain, was part of the Sterling Bloc restrictions, only £330,000 was sanctioned. The rest could be transferred in the form of goods such as medical supplies or other material like food. The Emergency Committee of the Federation decided on the purchase of some civilian aircraft on behalf of what was to become the Israeli Air Force. As the War of Independence progressed, air traffic to the infant state needed to be sustained. Boris Sr., one of the South Africans helping to set up the Israeli Air Force, was sent back to South Africa on a buying mission. An arms embargo had been placed on Palestine in the wake of partition, and any number of resourceful ways were being found to circumvent this. Together with the Fed, he formed an ostensible airline company called West Air Transport and purchased some Dakotas for use as passenger, mail, and goods carriers, having to fly a very circuitous route to Lida Airfield. It was later expanded into Universal Transport, along with other shareholders in partnership with the SA Zionist Fed, and with suitable livery and kosher meals, became the first Jewish airline servicing Israel well before El Al came into being. The planes were soon ceded to the Air Force as transport aircraft, as was the intention from the very start. Among the very first passengers of West Air were the South African volunteers who became part of the Israeli armed forces in the War of Independence. The majority had seen service during the Second World War, and many were handpicked for their specialized skills by an emissary sent especially from Israel. They became part of an international volunteer group known as Machal, with the South African contingent numbering 830. This was, again, proportionately far more than the number who came from far larger communities like the USA and Great Britain. Alongside them came 71 doctors, surgeons, and nurses who served in the medical corps. Back home, thousands who had been too young to serve in the Union Defense Forces volunteered for training at special training sites, usually on remote farms belonging to Jewish farmers, where they received the basics from Jewish ex-servicemen. And an air school for pilot training was organized by Cecil Margot. It's been estimated that nearly a third of the South African volunteers stayed on after the armistice, making new lives and their homes in Israel. What was the response of the South African government to this homegrown activity in support of Israel? Smuts had, despite some lapses, demonstrated his personal commitment to the maintenance of the aims of the Balfour Declaration. When it came to the matter of representation at the United Nations vote on partition, he instructed the South African delegate to support the Jewish agency's bid for an official place, and South Africa was one of the yes votes at the General Assembly that allowed the plan to be adopted. But Smuts was no longer the influential figure he had once been in wartime Britain. And since he had been so strongly linked to Churchill, the new Labour-led government there was indifferent to him. Besides, Smuts was faced with a crucial election at home that was consuming much of his attention and energy. He did break ranks with other British dominions, though, by giving recognition to the State of Israel 9 days after Ben-Gurion's declaration. When the election, with its shock victory for the reunited National Party came, South African Jewry were rattled. In an effort to allay fears in the community, the Board of Deputies requested an interview with newly appointed Prime Minister D.F. Malan almost immediately. They were happy to quote Malan's reassurance that there must be no discrimination in regard to the Jews who are in South Africa, but in case it gave rise to further uncertainty, they suppressed his qualifying remark, reiterating immigration as still being subject to debate. Malan and his government kept silent on the departure of Machal volunteers, nor did they impose any further restrictions on the material aid that was being sent to Israel by the Jewish community after a meeting with a delegation from the Zionist Federation. However, official recognition of the State of Israel from Malan only came a year later. The Transvaal Provincial Division of the National Party maintained their ban on anyone seeking membership who was not a Christian. Yet there were Jewish sympathizers, particularly in the Cape, and one Joseph Nossel had joined the party there and not only attempted to establish a Jewish supporters chapter, but tried to intercede with the government as a representative of the Jewish community. He was sternly censured by the board, which took the opportunity to reiterate its policy on party politics, namely that the board represented the community on discrimination and their rights as citizens. However, party affiliation was entirely a personal and individual matter. Malan cemented his modified attitude to the Jewish community by making a personal visit to the young state of Israel and returning enthused and impressed. As an ordained minister of his church, it had been his long-held ambition to visit the Holy Land, and it was in this capacity that he went, though he was the very first active head of a government to visit Israel and paid an unofficial courtesy call on David Ben-Gurion, his Israeli counterpart. In South Africa, the national government had begun its institution of the apartheid policies it had long championed. Several Afrikaner writers and thinkers attempted to draw comparisons with Israel in their drive toward a national purity and independence. This was firmly repudiated by an equal number of Jewish writers and public figures. Henry Katsu wrote in his column in the Zionist Record, one of a number of similar Jewish publications that were read by the community, that the Afrikaner cannot ask the black man to pay the price of his survival. He has to pay it himself. When the Union of South Africa was created in 1910, its constitution allowed for mixed-race, so-called coloured voters to remain on a common voters' roll in the Cape Province. In 1951, the nationalist government declared its intention to remove the coloured voters from the common roll and put them on a separate document. However, the early Liberal members of the Cape Legislature had ensured that voting rights could be altered only by a 2/3 majority of members of Parliament at a joint sitting of both houses. Now, the National Party had only a simple majority, but they went ahead and passed the legislation. An offshoot of the wartime Springbok Legion, which had been founded and led by a significant proportion of Jewish servicemen, was formed in protest. It was called the Torch Commando, with partial funding from Harry Oppenheimer, and it began staging a series of torchlight marches in protest. Since the leadership of the Springbok Legion were, for the most part, allied to leftist organizations such as the Communist Party, the Torch Commando provided a home and platform for those of more centrist beliefs, and it accommodated the community. The Torch Commando's strength was its appeal across diverse political affiliation, but it was implacably opposed by the nationalist government, who tried to limit the high level of protest the group organized against their legislation. Within 5 years, despite a series of rulings against them by the Supreme Court, the nationalists had gerrymandered the Senate and gained enough support for the 2/3 majority they needed to amend the Constitution. The Separate Representation of Voters Act was passed, and the Torch Commando rapidly dwindled away. Joe Slovo went from prominence in the Commando to prominence in the resurgent African National Congress. The year before, at a Congress of the Jewish Board of Deputies, a carefully worded resolution was passed saying that it repeats its conviction that the welfare of all sections of the population depends on the maintenance of all democratic institutions and the enjoyment of freedom and justice by all. This was a departure from the board's bedrock vow that it was concerned with representation of the Jewish community on matters affecting the Jewish community, and that party political affairs were a matter of individual conscience. Was this a shift in attitude and the adoption of a moral voice, or a guilt-assuaging generality?
You want to know if the board sat on the fence. The answer is yes, they did, but that was the responsible thing to do. It would have been irresponsible for them to have done anything else. Just remember that the board's mandate and main function is the Jewish civil and religious rights. It wouldn't have helped the Board of Deputies one little bit if it had become just another banned organisation. We're living now in the new South Africa. We forget what it's like to have no freedom of opinion or belief. And the South African government, the apartheid government, didn't want anybody criticising. As far as they were concerned, it was the best of all possible worlds, and if you didn't think so, then under the Suppression of Communism Act, you'd be suppressed, and under the General Law Amendments Act, you'd be banned, you'd be sent to jail, with or without going to court. It's a completely different world. The board, it would have been totally irresponsible for the board to do it, and particularly with the apartheid government that got into power in 1948 with 5 seats. And they were made up with people who had been leaders of the Ossewa Brandwag and the Grey Shirts. So the board behaved the way that Jewish communal organizations have always done for centuries, which is you don't stick your neck over the parapet. If you've got a ruler over you, you try and be as low power as possible, because the ruling community is not going to like it if you oppose it. There was lots of criticism from all sides. The international bodies, Jewish bodies, criticized us heavily But then it was easy for them. Nobody's going to do anything to them in America or Britain if they're criticising South Africa. The students at UCT were very harshly critical. In retrospect, should we have spoken out? Mervyn Smith, the late Mervyn Smith, who was the chairman of our board and the chairman of the national board, felt very strongly that we should have. And we've been punished because there's not a single Jewish family that doesn't have children living overseas. And they left because they weren't prepared to live under apartheid, particularly after Soweto and Sharpeville. So we've been punished.
One of the earliest pieces of legislation that the National Party instituted once it assumed power was the Suppression of Communism Act, which effectively banned the Communist Party of South Africa and made the dissemination of its ideology illegal. Many members of the South African Jewish community had affiliations or sympathies with the party from the 30s into the 40s, while it might be argued that even more had not. One of the principal architects and drafters of the Freedom Charter, which was adopted at the Congress of the People in Kliptown and articulated the policy of the African National Congress and its affiliates, was Rusty Bernstein. Its terse preamble famously proclaims its inclusive intentions. We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know. At one point, Rusty and his wife Hilda, as well as Ellie Weinberg and his family, and Ray and Michael Harmel, all lived Cater Corner from each other on this border of Orchards and Norwood, two Johannesburg neighborhoods with a strong Jewish presence. The apartheid security police, staking out this intersection of two streets, derisively refer to it as Red Square. Subsequent to the Congress of the People, the security branch, in a series of pre-dawn raids, arrested 140 people around the country on the charge of treason. The trial lasted from 1956 to 1961, changing venue from Johannesburg to Pretoria, and the old synagogue, which had become the notorious courtroom where judgment was finally made. Of the 23 white defendants, more than half were Jews, and their defense counsel featured an equally disproportionate roster of Jews. The defense team for the latter part of the trial was led by Izzy Maisels. He was assisted by Sidney Kentridge, son of the noted parliamentarian Maurice Kentridge, who had played such a significant role in the Jewish community over the decades. Their opposite number was Oswald Pirro, the former founder of the New Order, unrepentant in his Nazi sympathies of the war years. In essence, the antagonisms of the 30s were being played out in miniature in the deeply ironic setting of the synagogue-turned-courtroom. Well before the verdict was reached in the treason trial, the Jewish community was disconcerted by two events that intensified their unease. The Sharpeville massacre and the attack on Cato Manor police station fueled rumors of an imminent armed uprising. And together with a flare-up of anti-Semitic sentiments because of the marked Jewish presence in the treason trial, they made a significant section of the Jewish community skittish and beginning to question their future in this country. A state of emergency was declared, organizations and individuals were outlawed and banned, arrests were made, public meetings and demonstrations were forbidden. Apart from the youth movement graduates who leaned towards Aliyah, the first of the South African-born Jews started to contemplate a life elsewhere and began to consider arrangements for their relocation. The treason trial came to an end in 1961 when all of the remaining accused were released and Izzy Maisels was carried shoulder high by their victorious supporters from the Pretoria Old Synagogue. At the end of the 50s, the most liberal section of the old United Party broke away to form the Progressive Party. For most of the Jewish community who wished to oppose the apartheid policies and laws in an above-board, non-subversive way, the party was a natural home, indicated by the point that the sole constituency that managed to return a Progressive Party MP to Parliament was Houghton, home to a strong Jewish presence. Of course, Houghton had also been the pinnacle of aspiration as a place of residence for many Jews making their way up the social ladder. The returning member of Parliament for that constituency again and again, much to the disgust of the nationalists, was Helen Suzman. Born Helen Gavronsky to Litvak immigrant parents in Germiston, she entered Parliament as an MP for the United Party, making her maiden speech on the Matrimonial Affairs Bill, indicating the start of a strong activism on behalf of all women's rights regardless of racial or ethnic origin that ran concurrently with her racial equality and human rights standpoint. That same year, the United Party supported the Separate Amenities Bill that institutionalized apartheid. Along with one other United Party parliamentarian, Suzman walked out of the chamber, refusing to vote. Her dissatisfaction and frustration with her own party's policies led her to be central in the breakaway that formed the Progressive Party. None of her fellow Progressive Party founders managed to gain a seat in the following year's general election, and for 13 years Helen Suzman was a lone voice in Parliament, challenging the policies of the National Party, now led by Hendrik Verwoerd. She ate alone in the parliamentary dining room, was regularly the lone occupant of one side of the House when a division vote was called, and was one of the paltry few who would visit both political and civil prisoners to check on their welfare or mistreatment, and would speak for the disenfranchised. Her legendary caustic wit was her defense against the anti-Semitic and often misogynistic attacks repeatedly launched against her during parliamentary debates. She once advised later Prime Minister B.J. Vorster to visit a township heavily disguised as a human being. And when the leader of an extreme right-wing group challenged Suzman, boasting that her ancestors had carried the Bible over the mountains to teach the heathen blacks, and asked what Suzman's ancestors had done, Helen's reply was pithy and worthy of Benjamin Disraeli. Why, they wrote it, my dear. Helen Suzman's counterpart in many ways was Dr. Ellen Hellman. She was the daughter of Yekka immigrants, but those who had arrived at the turn of the last century and, like Helen, had studied at the University of the Witwatersrand. Though she stood as a city councillor for the Progressive Party, Hellman's activism was largely within the framework of the Institute of Race Relations. She served as its president at the time that Suzman was starting her first determined opposition to National Party legislation. Significantly, she was a long-standing executive member of the Board of Deputies, serving on its Public Relations Committee alongside Arthur Suzman. Together with Izzy Maisels, they typified the approach that engagement with South African society should be informed by a Jewish ethos, which was itself informed by a collective memory of persecution, and the social responsibility teachings of the ancient sages and rabbis. Back in the 30s, the board had supported the formation of a Jewish women's organization founded by a German immigrant called Toni Safra. Unlike other women's organizations that were affiliated either to a synagogue, the Zionist Federation, or specific Jewish charities such as orphanages or homes for the aged, the Union of Jewish Women was conceived to be one that would work within the Jewish community and, at the same time, reach out and work within the general South African community. Most of its activities could be construed as social work. Safra had been a social worker in Germany, but for a while it almost took a feminist slant in seeking to uplift the position of women within the constraints of halakha, or Jewish religious law. This proved highly controversial, however delicately and quietly the matter was approached. Other activities that were initiated by the UJW were also community-based, such as servicemen support during the war years and later support for Jewish conscripts into the South African Defence Force, kosher meals and wheels for the elderly, and the establishment of Hillel houses on various campuses for Jewish university students. Since their policy was a declared one of helping the welfare of the general community, in addition, the outreach programs were for all sections of the population, and the activities did not adhere to the institutionalized color bars of government policy. Given the support and affiliation with the Board of Deputies, it could be concluded that the board was engaged in social action without violating its non-political principles. The Liberal members of the Board of Deputies managed to pass the occasional resolution at the conferences that censured the repression and inequalities that came to represent grand apartheid. But they were usually restrained and weak or indecisive. Pressure began to mount from both the outside of the country and within for the board to have a standpoint and decry the political realities. During the 50s, Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz frequently denounced the ideology of apartheid from his pulpit as antithetical to Jewish values, attracting a sometimes heated response from his congregants and members of the board alike that he was placing the Jewish community at risk by confronting the government of the day. This "don't make waves" attitude intensified somewhat when Verwoerd became Prime Minister, since he was so strongly identified with the open anti-Semitism of the 30s. But by that time, Rabinowitz was winding up his tenure in South Africa and preparing to retire to Israel. It didn't help the arguments and standpoints at the time that Israel was making a concerted effort to engage with newly independent African states in an effort to draw them away from wholesale support of the Arab bloc. On two occasions in particular, censure of the South African representative at the United Nations, who happened to be Eric Lowe, one of the most unrepentant anti-Semites of the National Party in its varying forms, and over the issue of international sanctions against South Africa, Israel voted with the African states against South Africa. Many South African Jews who subscribed to the non-involvement, non-declarative stance of the Board of Deputies felt that they had been compromised by the Israeli votes and that it would be detrimental to the community. Both the Afrikaans press and the nationalist government wasted little time in calling out the Jewish community to respond to what they saw as perfidy and, in addition, raising the old complaints of dual loyalties. In addition, the South African government called a halt on the transfer of donations to the Zionist Fed to Israel. In the mid-50s, Andre Ungar, the foreign recruited rabbi of the Reform congregation in Port Elizabeth, had spoken openly and directly against apartheid. It caused an uproar amongst his congregation, one that spread to lap at the feet of the Board of Deputies and drew a swift reprisal from the nationalist government, who expelled Ungar from the country. The board kept silent. Conversely, another Reform rabbi in Cape Town, David Sherman, also spoke out at public meetings but received no such punishment. In 1963, a small farm on the outskirts of Johannesburg was raided by the security police and 17 people were arrested. All 5 of the whites arrested were Jews. When the Rivonia trial, as it was known, came before the courts, things were even more disconcerting for the South African Jewish community. The defense team, once again, was Jewish-dominated, though Joel Joffe and Arthur Chaskelson were led by Afrikaner Bram Fischer. Leading the prosecution, though, was Dr. Percy Utah, who was Deputy Attorney General of the Transvaal. He was also a past chairman of the United Hebrew Congregations Council and a devout member of the Walmerin Street Synagogue with, ironically, fellow congregant Izzy Maisels. Like many others in the community, Utah's parents were poor Litvak immigrants, and like others, Utah worked hard to better himself and managed to gain a scholarship to study for a law degree at the University of Cape Town. He declared that his target was always the position of Attorney General, but his career initially stalled because of the climate of anti-Semitism, and his first position within state service was as a debt tracer for the National Post Office. Thereafter, he methodically rose in the ranks. His goal of being an Attorney General and the first Jew in that position was only realized long after the Rivonia trial, but there's no doubt that his eventual elevation to that position was because of his conduct during the trial. Accounts of the trial stress his excessive zeal and vehemence in prosecuting the defendants and his genuine belief that they were an existential threat to the white community. What motivated Utah to cling so tightly to the nationalist government has long been debated. Was it a kind of defense of the Jewish community by proving that there were in fact good Jews who were loyal to the government of the day in the face of all these seditious Jews charged with sabotage and conspiracy? Had he wholeheartedly bought into the apartheid race theories? The government-supporting press of the day was filled with veiled and overt attacks on the Jewish community for being overrepresented amongst all the activists seeking an end to apartheid policies. Most of the community was silent on that matter, though there were many who supported Utah, and some public figures defended him against others in the community who decried his government association. Liberal-minded Jews still tended to support the Progressive Party. The Board of Deputies still strained for an ostensible neutrality, though those who thought the Jewish anti-apartheid activists were bad for the Jews were making their opinions known. And the appeals for the representatives of the community to take a stand against government policies came mainly from the youth. 3 of the Jewish youth movements had continued to promulgate an awareness of social justice and its attendant issues. Equality, the dignity of self-labor, and the brotherhood of man were principles shared by all 3. Hashomer Hatzair, which had been established in Europe early in the 20th century, had been one of the strongest promoters of the practical application of its socialist labor ideals in the form of the kibbutz, and its socially conscious philosophy was realized in that context. When Hashomer Hatzair was established in South Africa, the Communist Party was still a legal presence in the country, which was not the case by the time of the treason or Rivonia trials. By that time, the youth movement was very much diminished in terms of numbers, popularity, or influence. At the end of the decade, the shaliach or emissary sent from the Israeli headquarters of World Hashomer Hatzair to assist its leadership was detained by the security police for questioning, but was later released. The same thing had happened in the mid-50s also, without consequence. Anyway, the movement closed down permanently a matter of months later, an inevitability that had been discussed for some time given the unsustainable membership. In itself a consequence of the reluctance of South African Jewish parents to have their children be part of a youth movement with a radical reputation. The United Zionist Party had ceased its activities by the time of the Rivonia trial for the best of reasons. Nearly all its leadership had made Aliyah to Israel. Its youth wing was still partly viable, but since its Chalutzik leanings were very close in spirit and lacking the total commitment to the Marxist principles of Hashomer Hatzair, they decided to be subsumed into Habonim in 1961. While not as political as the other 2 youth movements, B'nai Tzion shared their commitment to self-labor, egalitarian principles, and human dignity. Habonim, which had started with a much more general intention closer to scouting for Jewish youth who were alienated by anti-Semitism from the actual Scout movement, refined its ideology over the decades subsequent to the Second World War. By 1959, its platform included such phrases as believes in a democratic way of life, in social justice and the brotherhood of man, with the firm intention that South African members would apply these sentiments to their own country. Nevertheless, the movement retained its independence and professed no association or support for any political party in South Africa, in the same way it was independent of any Israeli political party in relationship to its Zionist ideology. Most of its leadership, the Madrichim, were university students and, if not directly involved, associated with student activism on their campuses. There were very few Jewish students at the Afrikaans language universities, and the English universities were demonized by nationalists and the Afrikaans language press as hotbeds of sedition, radicalism, and rebellion. Some Habonim Madrichim were also members of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, an organization which so rattled the government that it was infiltrated by security branch spies, and some were, for a time, office bearers. An ethos of opposition to apartheid and racial discrimination was an unspoken element of the youth movement's social engagement, and at times brought Habonim into conflict with the Board of Deputies, if not as a whole, certainly with individual members of the board. But Habonim remained true to its Zionist orientation, and its further refinement of its ideology posed its members with a choice. At core, self-realization and fulfillment could only be achieved by aliyah to Israel and to kibbutz life. To live outside of Israel was to live in exile, in the diaspora, in galut, which was not just physical, but also a state of mind. And it was the galut experience they felt that forced South African Jews into their moral dilemma. It's significant, though, that so many of the Jewish activists in the anti-apartheid underground had passed through either Hashomer HaTzair or Habonim at some stage in their lives, and their subsequent disassociation from the youth movements was over Zionism and Jewish identity. In 1966, nationalist Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd was assassinated in Parliament over there. Later President P.W. Botha famously screamed at Helen Suzman, "You're responsible for this." And the post was filled by B.J. Vorster. Not as overtly and recognizably an anti-Semite as Verwoerd, Vorster had nevertheless been a member of the Stormjaars and had been interned for sedition in Koffiefontein by the Smuts wartime government. The Jewish community was, as a result, wary of a continuation of the resurgent anti-Semitism in the country, now refracted through Israeli anti-apartheid declarations. Matters changed with the Six-Day War of 1967. The Jewish community of South Africa once more mobilized in support of Israel as they had in 1948, with fundraising and with volunteers, though unlike 1948, the volunteers weren't a machal unit and did duty on kibbutzim and moshavim or worked in social or medical support services. An appeal to Vorster resulted in the embargo on the transfer of funds to Israel being temporarily suspended. This was partly because Israeli relations with the African bloc were somewhat strained over their support for the Arab states, and also because a strongly expressed support that was apparent across the board in South Africa in sympathy with the Jewish state over the war was being publicly expressed in newspapers and in communal forums. The community facilitated the transfer of a record number of blood units to Israel's Magen David Adom from the South African blood transfusion services by immediately replacing the local blood stocks in a series of remarkable blood drives that even had support from many non-Jews in the country. As it did with most international Jewish communities, the Israeli victory provided the South African Jewish community with a sense of pride and identity, and those who had been keeping below the radar in terms of their identity because of the political events of the earlier years were now out and proud in their affiliation. However,
If the Six-Day War provided the appearance and the actuality of a united community against any threat to Israel, within South Africa, the community was fractured by dissent over any number of community issues, but particularly how the community should engage with the society at large, and whether there should or should not be a community response to the apartheid policies of the government.
Early in the 70s, South Africa finally opened a consulate general in Tel Aviv. Even though Smuts had recognized Israel and Israel had consular representation in South Africa, the reciprocal move came just before the Yom Kippur War, at the point that Israel's relations with the rest of Africa rapidly soured as nation after nation broke off diplomatic ties with the Israeli state in favor of the Arab bloc states. At the same time, the Israelis reached out to anyone who would support them. And since South Africa was facing similar sanctions to the Jewish state, political expediency saw Israel finding common cause with South Africa, ushering in a period of cooperation, mostly covert, but a few activities were well publicized. In 1974, Israel upgraded its representation to ambassadorial level, to be reciprocated by South Africa the following year. This new relationship went as far as an official state visit by Prime Minister B.J. Vorster, something that proved highly controversial within the Jewish community, particularly when the Jewish Board of Deputies hosted a banquet in his honor on his return. The chairman of the board, David Mann, made an implied call for the end of racial discrimination couched in biblical quotes from the prophets in his speech at the banquet.
It was about as far as anyone in the executive of the board had gone, but it was still regarded as being undefined or ambiguous by the growing segment of the community that wanted an unequivocal declaration from the board. And the strongest call came from the youth of the community looking to the leadership to make a stand. The difference of opinion came close to open hostility, with some repudiating the younger generation and clinging to the long-held fears that this wouldn't be good for the Jewish community as a whole.
But some leaders were speaking out, and surprisingly from the pulpit. Under the leadership of Chief Rabbi Casper, who had succeeded Louis Rabinowitz, most of the South African rabbinate, whether Orthodox or Reform, either maintained a silence or supported Casper's apologist views, still mired in the "don't make waves, it's bad for the Jews" mentality. The story of 4 rabbis gives the lie to those who claimed the spiritual leadership was unduly passive and uninvolved at the time. Rabbi Ben Isaacson already spoke out against apartheid policies in the 50s loudly and clearly. His openly expressed views brought him into conflict with Percy Utah, who was the president of the congregation at the time and who called for his dismissal. But Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz came to Isaacson's defense and offered him a position in Krugersdorp. Isaacson continued his vocal expression, much to the dismay of several members of the Board of Deputies, and also became close to Ben and Mary Turok in the Congress of Democrats. When Ben Turok went into hiding, Isaacson took the Turok children into his own home, which was subsequently raided by the police. The Krugersdorp congregation was both outraged and embarrassed by Isaacson's involvement, and he was then sent to take charge of the congregation in Bloemfontein. There he became closely involved in the activities of Habonim, even serving on its national executive, and helped shape the youth movement's moral standpoint as well as guiding its Judaic content. But by 1965, he decided to make Aliyah to Israel. He returned as a Reform rabbi shortly before the Soweto students' uprising of 1976 and resumed his outspokenness and involvement with anti-apartheid activities.
Again, most of his congregation rejected his stand, and he parted ways to found an independent synagogue most closely allied to the American conservative movement.
In addition, he helped found Jews for Social Justice, was a member of the Release Mandela Committee, and formed an association with the Reverend Beyers Naudé of the South African Council of Churches. After a lecture tour of the United States in support of anti-apartheid organizations, his Harel congregation fired him and disbanded the congregation. Ben Isaacson eventually found a place in Zimbabwe, serving the Jewish community there, and joined the African National Congress in exile, the first rabbi to do so. Rabbi David Rosen, an English Jew from a distinguished rabbinical family, had been living and working in Israel when he was asked to become the spiritual advisor to the South African Union of Jewish Students in Cape Town. He was subsequently appointed the rabbi of the popular Sea Point Synagogue, where he became increasingly outspoken on political issues, often sharing a platform at public protests in the city with leaders of various church denominations to denounce apartheid practices.
After one particular gathering here outside St. George's Cathedral, he began to receive irregular death threats and was alerted to his phone being tapped. In addition, articles in the Cape Town Afrikaans press denounced him, and members of his congregation complained to the Board of Deputies, even though the executive director and council supported Rabbi Rosen.
When the time came for him to renew his work and residence permit as a non-South African, it was made clear by the authorities that this would be refused, and David Rosen decided to return to Israel. Today, he is the director of the American Jewish Committee's Department of Interreligious Affairs and is the liaison for the AJC and the chief rabbinate in Israel with the Vatican. Rabbi Adi Asavi was appointed to the Johannesburg Progressive Congregation's Temple Shalom the same year that President P.W. Botha, the successor to B.J. Vorster, declared a state of emergency in South Africa in response to increasing civil protests against the government. Asabi took up his post in a particularly fraught and heightened atmosphere. Most significantly, he advocated practical responses amongst his congregation and the Jewish community. His belief in a practical application of Jewish values in the South African situation found expression in his pamphlet recommending how Jews could ameliorate the experience of their domestic workers through acceptable basic wages and working conditions. One of his most controversial acts was his invitation to Nelson Mandela to address his congregation very soon after Mandela's release from Victor Verster prison. The reason this was so controversial was because Mandela had met with Yasser Arafat and had expressed support for a Palestinian state. Some of the community hostility and controversy with regard to Rabbi Asabi were to do with internal politics within the South African progressive Jewish congregations, and Asabi's move from accepted reform practices to something akin to the American conservative movement. Rabbi Norman Bernard, on the other hand, was decisively a member of the Orthodox world and a devoted follower of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Originally from the United States and appointed to Johannesburg's Oxford Synagogue in 1963, the year of the Rivonia trial, Bernard's initial activities were entirely within the community, hewing to a strictly Orthodox line and supportive of the Board of Deputies' then ostensibly apolitical approach. However, having been a leader in the community through the difficult conflicts of the 60s and the tumultuous events of the 70s, as that decade came to an end, Rabbi Bernard became outspoken about the Jewish ethical responses to racism, discrimination, and the plight of black South Africans. In 1980, he established the Oxford Synagogue Social Action Committee, drawing on the skills of his congregants, many of whom were themselves leaders in fields such as law, education, and social work. OSSAC, or OSAC, was essentially an outreach program tailored to the needs of black domestic workers in the neighborhood surrounding the synagogue. Adult education and literacy were foremost in their activities, along with legal aid, but social activities were also provided. Like Rabbi Adi Asabi, Rabbi Bernard sought to influence his congregants to behave ethically in relation to their workers and implement non-discriminatory practices. And along with Rabbi Ben Isaacson, he was one of the Jews for Social Justice founders, being particularly outspoken in that forum. In the face of the rising emigration numbers within the Jewish community, he was unequivocal in his belief, mandated by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that South Africa had an optimistic future for all its people, and the community should stay. If they were to leave, the only acceptable reason would be to make Aliyah to Israel.
Towards the end of the 80s, the winds of change were blowing once more through the south of the African continent, and strongly at that. Certain strongly maintained tenets of apartheid were beginning to be dismantled. Covert meetings between the ANC and old order South Africans were being held. More and more expressions of group antipathy to the apartheid state were apparent.
South Africa had introduced military conscription during the state of emergency in the 60s. Young South African men on completion of their schooling were expected to do service, and young Jews were not exempt, though aspects such as kosher food, Jewish chaplains, and leave to observe Shabbat were accommodated. Initial opposition to serving as a military force that sustained apartheid policies was straightforward. Those who refused the draft emigrated and went into exile.
Others served their time in a defense force that was rife with open anti-Semitism. Many South Africans my age recall the epithets of Jew boy and Yuiki, little Jew, being bandied about with total nonchalance.
Growing awareness of the military defense of apartheid, whether in the harsh suppression of dissent in the townships or the increasingly brutal border war, was intolerable for many young white men, and among them many young Jews. Some, like David Bruce, who refused to serve, were sentenced to lengthy imprisonment. Laurie Nathan was one of the founders of the End Conscription campaign that increasingly gained support and respect. When Rabbi Bernard Casper, whose term as chief rabbi had been marked by increasingly conservative viewpoints, was appealed to on the issue of military conscription, he declared that he could find no halachic support for refusal to do military service on ethical grounds. This pronouncement provoked dismay among many young Jews who were struggling to balance their social justice awareness and their Judaism. Casper's successor as chief rabbi, Cyril Harris, displayed no such conservative views nor reticence in political pronouncements from the moment he first took the pulpit in South Africa. His Scottish background may have contributed to his forthrightness and openness, but his direct engagement with the issue of the South African Jewish community and its responses to apartheid was warmly embraced by most of the community.
By his own admission, he arrived in the country as apartheid was dying, something that had been recognized by the community, who were mostly accepting of his encouragement of them to hasten its demise. From his first address to the community, Rabbi Harris made it clear that in his view, Jewish morality and ethics were unquestionably in opposition to apartheid. Though there were a few dissenting individuals who clung to the notion that political expression should still be on an individual basis, the Board of Deputies had already passed a resolution at its conference in 1985 that directly condemned apartheid.
The year after Rabbi Harris's arrival in South Africa, he went with the Jews for Social Justice delegation to meet with the ANC in Lusaka, and also forged a personal association with many of the black religious and political leaders back in South Africa. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from imprisonment. 6 months later, he requested an initial meeting with the leaders of the Jewish community to be organized by Izzy Maisels, who included representatives of the boards of deputies and the Zionist Federation, as well as Helen Suzman and the chief rabbi. Mandela subsequently met with leading Jewish industrialists to discuss the economic prospects of the country. He even invited Percy Utah, the prosecutor of the Rivonia trial, to lunch. Harris developed a close and warm personal friendship with Mandela, to the point that he and his wife Anne were on first-name terms, and Mandela began to refer to him as "my rabbi." At the inauguration of the first democratically elected president of a non-racial South Africa, the chief rabbi was on the podium to pronounce a benediction on behalf of the Jewish community. When Nelson Mandela married Graça Machel a few years later, Harris blessed their union, and when Mandela made his visit to Israel, he requested that he be accompanied by Harris.
The Jewish community engaged enthusiastically with their new civil society. During the transition period, a special committee of Jewish legal experts and communal leaders made submissions to the Constitutional Assembly on the new Bill of Rights, as did the Board of Deputies. In the years following the first elections, Jews were represented both in the ruling party as well as the official opposition.
Jill Marcus would first be Deputy Minister of Finance and later Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, becoming the first woman to hold the position of Governor in 2009. Arthur Chaskalson became the first President of the Constitutional Court and later Chief Justice of South Africa, while Albie Sachs, son of trade unionist Solly Sachs, would also be a Justice of the Constitutional Court. Chief Rabbi Cyril Harris continued being a uniting force in the community, establishing with businessman Bertie Lubner MaAfrika Tikkun, an umbrella organization that would coordinate the various philanthropic efforts of the Jewish community towards the transformation of South African society. He even delivered a eulogy for Joe Slovo, avowed communist and atheist, at his funeral, praising him as an humanitarian. In an effort to find some closure for the iniquities of the apartheid years, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to provide restorative justice for the victims was established in 1996 under the chairmanship of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Rabbi Harris appeared before it to make a submission on behalf of the entire Jewish community of South Africa. Acknowledging that the community had benefited, like all white South Africans, from apartheid, he asked forgiveness.